He stared at the map in silence. Thousands of tiny red flags stretched across it, marking divisions, cities, supply routes. It was June 1941. Outside the window, the night over Berlin was quiet. Inside, Adolf Hitler made the decision that would destroy his empire. He called it Operation Barbarossa. His generals called it madness. 3 million German soldiers stood ready on the Soviet border. They thought the war was already won. France had fallen in weeks. Britain was isolated. Now, Hitler believed he could crush the Soviet Union before winter. He told his generals, "Kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will collapse." They believed him, or pretended to. None of them knew that this single order would turn victory into disaster. East of that border, Soviet farmers were plowing their fields, unaware that 3,000 tanks and 2,700 aircraft were aimed at them. At 3:15 a.m., the first shells fell on Brest Fortress. Within minutes, the largest invasion in human history had begun. For the first weeks, it worked perfectly. German panzers rolled across the plains like a storm. Entire Soviet divisions vanished. Every morning, Wehrmacht reports used the same word, Erfolg, success. Cities fell in days, Smolensk, Minsk, Kiev. In Berlin, Hitler smiled for the cameras. He was convinced the war in the East would end by Christmas. But maps don't show hunger. They don't show exhaustion. They don't show the quiet decisions that destroy empires. And one of those decisions came in July 1941, when Hitler overruled his generals for the first time. He ordered his army to split. Instead of driving straight toward Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, he diverted the tanks south to Ukraine and north to Leningrad. His generals begged him to stay focused on the capital. They said if Moscow fell, the Soviet command would collapse. Hitler refused. He wanted resources, oil, grain, coal, not just territory. He said, "My generals know nothing about the economic foundations of war." That decision broke the momentum. German forces lost speed, time, and fuel. By the time the order came to resume the push toward Moscow, autumn had arrived. Rain turned the Russian roads into rivers of mud. Engines froze, horses sank, trucks became useless. The Wehrmacht, once a lightning-fast machine, now crawled mile by mile toward a city that refused to fall. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, Stalin had recovered from his initial shock. The man who hid in silence for days after the invasion was now reorganizing his armies. He called it the Great Patriotic War. And for the first time, the Soviet people fought not just for a leader, but for survival itself. In the ruins of Smolensk, Soviet troops formed desperate defenses. They fought to the last bullet, not to win, but to buy time. Time for factories to move east, time for reinforcements to arrive from Siberia, time for winter to come. But Hitler didn't see time as a threat. He saw it as proof of his own brilliance. When his generals warned him of overstretched supply lines, he mocked them. He believed that willpower could replace logistics, that ideology could replace fuel. He said, "We have only to kick open the door and the whole house will collapse." It was the same phrase he had used before the invasion. Now it was becoming a curse. As German troops advanced, they noticed something strange. Every village was burning, every field destroyed, every rail line mined. The Soviets called it scorched earth. They destroyed everything that could feed, fuel, or shelter the invaders. What the Germans captured was land, not victory. Behind them stretched hundreds of miles of emptiness, no food, no warmth, no roads. Their tanks consumed more fuel than they could deliver. Their soldiers looted grain that made them sick. They were winning on paper and dying in reality. Then came October. The offensive toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, began. German soldiers were told it would be the final push, take Moscow, and the war is over. But nature had other plans. The skies opened, endless rain fell, the earth became liquid, trucks sank to their axles, artillery had to be pulled by hand, men collapsed in the mud and were left there, too weak to move. Still, they advanced. By November, the spires of Moscow were visible through the snow. German reconnaissance planes photographed the Kremlin. They thought the Soviet capital was about to fall. Hitler announced to his staff, "The enemy is finished." But in those same days, the first Siberian divisions were arriving, men trained for cold, armed with new rifles wrapped in fur. They had been waiting for one signal, that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East. Once Stalin was sure, he released them westward. They arrived at the perfect moment, when the German army was at its breaking point. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze solid overnight. Lubricants turned to wax. Rifles cracked when fired. German soldiers wrapped newspaper around their legs to keep warm. Their summer uniforms were useless. They burned maps, chairs, and even ammunition crates to survive the nights. And then, in early December, the Red Army struck back. It wasn't a massive counteroffensive, just waves of infantry, tanks, and ski troops, but it shattered the illusion of German invincibility. Whole divisions were forced to retreat for the first time. Officers who disobeyed orders to hold positions were executed by their own side. Hitler refused to retreat, he said, not one step back. For him, tactical flexibility was weakness. For his soldiers, it was death. As the front collapsed, Hitler did something no German leader had ever done before. He took direct control of the army. He dismissed generals who disagreed with him. He surrounded himself with yes-men and loyalists. Strategy gave way to stubbornness. He would no longer allow withdrawals. He would turn every battlefield into a fortress. But winter didn't care about ideology. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. Tens of thousands lost fingers, hands, and feet. Horses froze standing up. Fuel lines burst, and the Soviets kept coming. By January 1942, the Wehrmacht had lost 500,000 men. The invincible army was bleeding to death in snow it had never prepared for. Still, Hitler insisted on new offensives. He refused to learn, refused to adapt. He believed that the enemy was weaker, that sheer willpower could bend reality. But reality was changing faster than he could react. Factories in the Urals were now producing more tanks, planes, and guns than Germany could imagine. Entire Soviet cities had been rebuilt underground. Women worked 12-hour shifts to replace every destroyed machine. Germany had started the war with superior weapons. Now, the Soviets had superior numbers, and time was on their side. Yet Hitler still believed he could win with one bold stroke. He told his generals that the next campaign would bring total victory. He said, "We will strike south, take the oil fields, and cut off their life." That decision would lead to Stalingrad and the death of his empire. But for now, in the winter of 1942, the German army dug into the frozen soil, waiting for spring. They didn't know it yet, but they were already defeated. The question was not if they would lose, but how long it would take. In Berlin, reports were rewritten to hide the truth. Losses were reclassified as temporary setbacks. Casualties became reallocations. But soldiers wrote letters home that told a different story. They described frostbitten comrades, broken equipment, and endless retreats. They described hunger, fear, and silence. They described a war that no longer made sense. Hitler ignored them all. He still believed the Soviets were on the verge of collapse. He didn't understand that the Soviet collapse had already happened and rebuilt itself stronger. The Red Army was no longer the same force that panicked in 1941. Now it was hardened, coordinated, and relentless. By the time the snow began to melt, the Eastern Front had consumed 2 million lives. Every mile of ground had been bought with blood. And in the Kremlin, Stalin smiled quietly. He knew the tide was turning. Hitler's fatal mistake wasn't invading the Soviet Union. It was believing he couldn't lose. Spring came late that year. When the snow melted, it revealed a graveyard that stretched for miles. Broken helmets, rusted guns, bones half buried in mud. The Eastern Front wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a continent-sized wound. Hitler looked at the map again. He refused to see disaster. He saw opportunity. The South, he said, was the key. Oil, that was what Germany needed. Without it, tanks wouldn't move, planes wouldn't fly, and industry would die. In April 1942, he gave a new order. Forget Moscow. Forget Leningrad. The next offensive would strike toward the Caucasus. He called it Case Blue. His generals hesitated. They had lost too many men, too much equipment. But no one dared argue anymore. The last general who did, Franz Halder, had been dismissed after questioning Hitler's intuition. So they planned in silence. The idea was simple on paper. Capture the oil fields of Baku, cut off the Volga River, and starve the Soviet Union. But there was one city standing in the way, Stalingrad. A city that carried not only strategic value but Stalin's name. Hitler wanted it erased. He told his staff, "If I take Stalingrad, it will break the Soviet will." He didn't realize it would break his own army instead. By June 1942, the offensive began. Columns of panzers rolled south through endless wheat fields. The Luftwaffe bombed Soviet supply lines day and night. At first, it worked. Towns fell, rivers were crossed, German soldiers advanced faster than they had in months. It felt like the glory days again. But the map was deceiving. Every mile they gained stretched their supply lines thinner. Fuel ran out faster than it could be delivered. Engines overheated. Tanks were abandoned simply because there wasn't enough gasoline to move them. Still, Hitler demanded more speed, more risk, more victories. By August, German reconnaissance planes reached the Volga River. They looked down on Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city wrapped in smoke. Factories lined the riverbank. Every building was filled with workers producing weapons even as bombs fell around them. When the first German shells hit, the city erupted in fire. Within days, Stalingrad was unrecognizable, a ruin of twisted steel and burning oil. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, was ordered to take the city street by street. Hitler told him, "You will capture it whatever the cost." The cost would be hundreds of thousands of lives. The Soviets refused to surrender. Civilians dug trenches, factory workers picked up rifles, women became snipers, nurses, and messengers. The Volga ferries ran day and night, bringing reinforcements across under constant fire. They called it the River of Death. Inside the ruins, the fighting turned personal. It wasn't about tanks or artillery anymore. It was about rooms, staircases, and basements. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand with knives, shovels, and bare fists. A factory changed hands 6 times in one day. Snipers haunted every corner. They said if you survived one day in Stalingrad, you were a veteran. The Germans called it the Rat War. The Soviets called it survival. But even as the battle raged, Hitler made his second fatal mistake. He ordered the advance toward the Caucasus to continue, splitting his army once again. 2 fronts, 1 supply line, and no margin for failure. His generals begged him to stop, to focus on one objective. He refused, and he said, "We will reach the Volga and the Caucasus at the same time." He wanted both victory and oil, but he would get neither. By October, the Germans controlled 90% of Stalingrad. Only small Soviet pockets held out near the river. Paulus reported that final victory was close. Hitler sent him a promotion and congratulations. But what Paulus didn't know was that Soviet generals were already preparing the trap. Hundreds of miles north and south of Stalingrad, the Red Army was massing troops in secret. Fresh divisions from Siberia, new tanks, and thousands of Katyusha rockets. The Germans were focused on the city. They didn't see what was happening beyond it. On November 19, 1942, the ground shook. Soviet artillery opened fire in 2 massive waves, north and south of Stalingrad. It wasn't an assault on the city. It was an assault on the flanks, manned not by Germans, but by their weaker allies, Romanians and Italians. They collapsed within hours. The Soviets drove deep behind the German lines, and within 4 days, they met near the town of Kalash. The trap was closed. 300,000 Axis soldiers were surrounded, cut off in the freezing ruins of Stalingrad. No escape, no supply, no hope. Paulus radioed for permission to break out. Hitler replied, "You will hold your ground. The Sixth Army will be supplied by air." His staff knew it was impossible. The Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed, but no one dared tell him. Days turned into weeks. The soldiers ran out of food, fuel, and medicine. They ate horses, then dogs, then boiled leather belts. Frostbite spread faster than the Soviets. Inside the ruins, men froze to death next to burned-out tanks. The temperature dropped to -40. And still, Hitler insisted they fight to the last bullet. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was finished. The Soviets offered surrender. Paulus refused until the moment his headquarters was surrounded. On January 31st, he sent his final message. "The army has done its duty to the last man." Then the radio went silent. When news reached Berlin, Hitler locked himself in his office. He had promised that Stalingrad would fall. Instead, it became his greatest defeat. He promoted Paulus to field marshal that morning and sneered, "No German field marshal has ever been captured alive." But Paulus refused suicide. He surrendered with 91,000 men. Only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad wasn't just a lost battle. It was the turning point of the entire war. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility shattered. And for the first time, the Soviets believed they could win. Across the Eastern Front, the balance shifted. The Red Army began to push west. Each month, the line moved closer to Germany. Each victory fueled revenge. Entire towns that had been destroyed by the Germans were now avenged by Soviet artillery. The hunters had become the hunted. In Berlin, Hitler raged at his generals. He blamed everyone but himself. He said they lacked faith, discipline, and courage. He replaced commanders almost weekly. By mid-1943, his headquarters had become a place of fear and paranoia. No one dared contradict him. Plans were made not to win, but to please him. The man who once relied on daring now relied on delusion. Yet even after Stalingrad, he still dreamed of turning the tide. He ordered a new offensive, Operation Citadel, aimed at a place called Kursk. It would be the largest tank battle in history. He called it the decisive blow. But his enemies were ready. The Soviets had intercepted his plans weeks earlier. They built miles of defenses, trenches, mines, and anti-tank guns. When the German attack began in July 1943, it was like charging into a wall of fire. Tiger tanks exploded, Panthers burned, planes were shot down faster than they could take off. Within 10 days, the offensive collapsed. Germany had lost its last chance to regain the initiative. After Kursk, the Red Army never stopped advancing. From that moment on, the war became a retreat. A long, slow, bloody retreat that would not end until Berlin itself was in ruins. But even as the Eastern Front turned into a nightmare, Hitler refused to see reality. He still believed he could negotiate, that the Western Allies would turn against Stalin. He thought his enemies would destroy each other before they destroyed him. It was a fantasy born from desperation. Meanwhile, his soldiers paid the price. They fought not for victory, but survival. Frozen, starving, surrounded, holding villages no one remembered the names of. Letters home spoke of endless snow, endless orders, endless death. They no longer fought for ideology. They fought to see another sunrise, and still, new orders came from Berlin. Hold this, defend that, no retreat, no surrender, no mercy. By the end of 1943, the Red Army stood at the Dnieper River, the same place the Germans had crossed 2 years earlier on their way to glory. Now they were crossing it in reverse. Each bridgehead cost thousands of lives, but it didn't matter. The Soviet war machine had become unstoppable. Hitler's empire, once stretching from the Channel to the Caucasus, was shrinking day by day. Factories were bombed, cities were starving, the once proud Wehrmacht was now a skeleton army. Yet, inside his bunker, Hitler still stared at his maps, moving imaginary divisions that no longer existed. He believed one last miracle weapon, one last counterattack, one last act of will could turn everything around. But history doesn't bend to faith. It bends to reality. And reality was closing in from every direction. The train carrying the survivors from Stalingrad was silent. No victory songs, no speeches, only the sound of wheels grinding against frozen rails. Inside, half-starved soldiers stared through broken windows at the snow-covered land they once called conquered. They were no longer an army. They were ghosts returning from a grave called the Eastern Front. In Berlin, Hitler refused to meet them. He called them cowards for surrendering. He told his generals, "The strong must be victorious. The weak must perish." But in truth, it was his own strategy that was dying, one rigid command at a time. The defeat at Stalingrad had shaken everything. For the first time, the illusion of German invincibility was gone. Entire cities whispered it, factories whispered it, even his inner circle began to doubt. But Hitler didn't see Stalingrad as a warning. He saw it as betrayal, a failure of others to carry out his will. He tightened his grip even more. He replaced professional commanders with loyalists. He refused withdrawals, even when encirclement was certain. He said, "We will fight where we stand." And so they did, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, trapped, starving, dying, holding positions that no longer mattered. Spring of 1943 came with new orders. Operation Citadel, the target, Kursk, a bulge in the Soviet lines. Hitler wanted one last grand offensive to erase the humiliation of Stalingrad. He promised his generals the decisive blow that would end the war in the East. But the Soviets already knew. They had broken German codes, they had dug in, laid thousands of mines, and built endless lines of defense. They were waiting. On July 5th, the German assault began. The roar of tanks echoed across the fields. The largest armored battle in history. Panzers advanced through fire and smoke, crushing earth beneath them. But every mile was a trap. Soviet guns opened up from hidden trenches. Minefields tore through entire divisions. For days, the front burned with metal and men. Then, when the German attack finally stalled, the Red Army struck back. The sky filled with Soviet aircraft. 34 tanks rolled forward in waves. The German spearhead, once unstoppable, was shattered. By the end of July, the Battle of Kursk was lost. Germany would never launch another major offensive in the East. From that point on, the Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was surviving. Back in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler received the reports. He stared at the maps for hours, unmoving. He refused to believe the numbers. He still spoke of final victory. He told his staff that new wonder weapons would change everything. Rockets, jets, new tanks. But no invention could stop the reality closing in from every direction. By late 1943, the Soviets were pushing west. City after city was liberated. Smolensk, Kiev, Kharkov, the same cities that had once marked Germany's triumph now became symbols of its undoing. Every retreat left behind scorched land, mass graves, and the ghosts of an empire built on arrogance. Inside Berlin, the atmosphere changed. Once full of parades and propaganda, the city was now dark, silent, fearful. Air raids became constant. People slept in shelters, whispering rumors that the war would soon reach them. And still, Hitler promised victory. He said, "If the German people cannot win this war, they do not deserve to exist." That was his final transformation, from leader to destroyer. His war was no longer about conquest. It was about dragging everything down with him. By 1944, the Red Army stood on the borders of Poland. From the west, Allied bombers were burning German cities to ashes. From the east, Soviet tanks were crossing the same fields the Wehrmacht had once stormed in triumph. History had reversed itself. In July, Hitler faced another shock, not from his enemies, but from within. A bomb exploded inside his headquarters during a meeting. It was an assassination attempt by his own officers. He survived, barely, protected by the heavy table that took the blast. But something inside him changed. He became paranoid. He trusted no one. He saw treason everywhere. Dozens were executed. Even men who had served him faithfully were hanged with piano wire, their deaths filmed as warnings. From that day on, Hitler no longer spoke of strategy. He spoke only of betrayal and destiny. His empire was collapsing, but he refused to face it. He still believed that faith and willpower could turn defeat into victory. The same delusion that began in 1941 had now consumed him completely. By early 1945, the Soviet army stood less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. The sound of artillery could already be heard in the capital. Refugees flooded westward, endless columns of people escaping their own country. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years was now measured in weeks. In April, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army closed in. Every corner became a battlefield. Every cellar became a bunker. German children, wearing uniforms too large for their bodies, carried rifles they barely understood. They fought not for victory, but for a lie that no longer had a voice. Underground, in a concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler still held his meetings. Maps lay scattered across the table, lines and symbols that no longer meant anything. He ordered armies that didn't exist, divisions that had already been destroyed. He told his generals that Steiner's forces would counterattack, but there were no such forces left. Outside, the city burned. The Soviets were less than a kilometer away. Every hour, the walls trembled with explosions. Still, he refused to surrender. He said, "I will not fall into the hands of the enemy." And so, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. The man who had once dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich ended it in a bunker surrounded by ruins. Above ground, Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag. For them, it was more than victory. It was revenge for every city destroyed, every family lost, every winter endured. The empire that had brought death to millions was itself buried beneath the rubble. But history doesn't end in silence. In the months that followed, the world began to see what had been hidden. The camps, the mass graves, the endless lists of names that would never be spoken again. The war in the East had not only destroyed armies, it had revealed the darkest depths of human cruelty. When the smoke cleared, Germany was gone, its cities reduced to dust, its people starving, its soldiers scattered or dead. The Eastern Front had swallowed everything, millions of lives, a generation of men, and the very idea of invincibility. And yet, out of that devastation, one truth remained. Empires built on fear always fall the same way, not from defeat alone, but from the blindness of those who believe they can never fail. Hitler's greatest blunder wasn't choosing to fight the Soviet Union. It was believing that his will could rewrite reality. That faith was stronger than winter. That arrogance could outlast time. In the end, the same land he tried to conquer consumed him. The same roads his armies once marched turned to graves beneath their boots. And the same silence that began with a map in June 1941 ended 4 years later, in a bunker under a ruined city with nothing left but echoes. The war was over. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of a world trying to understand what it had just survived. In the ruins of Berlin, smoke still drifted between broken walls. Children searched for food in the rubble. Old men wandered through empty streets, clutching memories of a nation that no longer existed. The Reich that promised glory had left behind only ashes. The victors divided Germany into zones, Soviets in the east, Allies in the west, lines drawn on maps by tired men in distant rooms. But those lines would become the borders of a new world, a world split not by armies, but by fear. The Cold War began not with a battle, but with a shadow, a silent race between two new powers rising from the ruins of the old. On one side, the Soviet Union, scarred, victorious, and unyielding. It had lost more than 20 million lives, but it had survived, and survival had turned it into something harder than steel. On the other, the United States, untouched by invasion, stronger than ever, and armed with the weapon that had ended the war in the Pacific, the atomic bomb. Between them lay a broken continent, haunted by memories of a man who believed the world could be ruled by will alone. But even as new alliances formed and old enemies became partners, one truth lingered like a scar beneath the surface. Everything that had begun with Operation Barbarossa had reshaped the planet. The Eastern Front had not just been a battlefield, it had been the furnace in which the modern world was forged. The Soviet Union's rise to superpower status was built on the ashes of that struggle. Entire cities had been rebuilt in months. Industry surged eastward, beyond the reach of Europe's old empires. The Red Army, once desperate and broken, now stood as the largest military force on Earth. And in the West, the lesson was burned into every leader's mind: never again underestimate the scale of war in the East. Never again believe that ideology can replace logistics. Never again think that one man's conviction can outlast reality. But history has a way of repeating itself, not in form, but in feeling. The arrogance, the blindness, the refusal to see limits. These patterns survive long after the names are forgotten. In the years after Hitler's death, the myth of his genius began to crumble. Documents revealed how often he ignored his generals, how often his obsession with ideology replaced reason, how his pride turned victories into disasters, and how his empire collapsed not from weakness, but from the very strength he believed would make it eternal. His blunder wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. He fought a war against reality itself. He believed history would bend to his vision, that the world could be conquered by sheer will. And for a time, it looked like it could. But the Eastern Front had no patience for illusions. Its scale stripped away everything human arrogance tried to build. Here, victory belonged not to the bold, but to the prepared, not to those who shouted loudest, but to those who endured longest. And the Soviets endured. Through hunger, cold, and death. Through entire cities destroyed and rebuilt again. Through the loss of millions. They endured until endurance itself became a weapon. For the German soldiers who returned home, the few who did, there was no parade waiting for them. Only silence. They came back to a country they didn't recognize, to faces that asked questions they couldn't answer. How do you explain fighting for a lie? How do you tell the truth about a war that never should have begun? Many never did. They simply disappeared into ordinary life, haunted by what they'd seen, by what they'd done, and by what they had once believed was destiny. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the victory was rewritten into legend. The Great Patriotic War became sacred, a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and strength. It became the foundation of a nation's identity. But even there, the cost was never truly spoken aloud. Entire generations vanished into the snow, cities rebuilt themselves over bones, and yet the story told was one of triumph, not tragedy. That's how empires remember wars, not as warnings, but as proof that they were right to fight them. Decades passed. The scars faded from the landscape, but not from history. The same rail lines that once carried tanks now carried tourists. The same cities once leveled by artillery now gleamed with new glass and steel. But beneath every foundation lay the same frozen soil, the same ground that had swallowed millions. In the West, historians still debate the numbers. How many died? How many froze? How many simply vanished into the snow, their names lost in languages no one remembers? But numbers don't tell the story. What matters is the pattern, how one decision, made in arrogance, can reshape the world for generations. Operation Barbarossa began as a conquest. It ended as a mirror, showing every empire what happens when power outgrows reason. It showed that wars are not lost on battlefields alone. They're lost in minds, in the refusal to adapt, in the obsession with being right, in the belief that history is destiny. For Hitler, the Eastern Front was supposed to prove his greatness. Instead, it revealed his humanity and the fragility that comes with it. Even now, decades later, the lessons remain the same. When leaders stop listening, when nations worship certainty over truth, when power replaces understanding, the fall always follows. It may not come in a blizzard or a siege. It may come quietly, in decisions made in rooms where no one dares to disagree. That's how empires end. Not in fire, but in silence. And so, the ruins of Berlin stand as more than a warning. They are a reflection of how far ambition can go before it turns on itself, of how a 1,000-year dream can vanish in 4 winters, of how one man's belief in his own infallibility can destroy a world. The snow has melted, the armies are gone, but the echoes remain, in every flag that rises too high, in every leader who refuses to listen, in every nation that forgets how quickly power can turn to dust. History doesn't shout its warnings. It whispers them, through the wind across old battlefields, through the silence of graves without names, through the ruins of a war that began with one man pointing at a map. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The sound of boots on frozen ground, the echo of engines dying in the cold, the silence after the shouting stops. That is where all empires end, not with a roar, but with the quiet realization that they were never immortal. The war is gone. The guns have fallen silent. But history doesn't disappear when the smoke clears. It lingers. It waits. It watches. The Eastern Front didn't just end in 1945. It continued in minds, in memories, in the quiet rewriting of truth. For those who lived through it, it never really ended at all. Every winter's chill, every sound of thunder, every train whistle echoing in the distance, a reminder of what the world had seen and what it had chosen to forget. The men who once followed Hitler's banners aged into old men with trembling hands. They sat on park benches feeding pigeons, their uniforms replaced by coats and silence. Some said they were victims of history. Others said they were its architects. But none could ever escape what they'd been a part of. For the survivors on the other side, the soldiers who fought in the Red Army, the villagers who buried their families in shallow graves, the children who grew up among ruins, the memory became something different, not pride, not even hatred, something colder. A lesson burned too deep to fade. Never again let arrogance decide the fate of millions. But the world forgets easily. Generations pass, stories turn into statistics, monuments become tourist stops, and once again, men in polished rooms speak of power, of destiny, of borders and resources, as if history had never whispered its warning. Hitler's fatal mistake wasn't just invading the East. It was believing he understood it. He thought the war could be won through calculation, through will, through speed. But the East isn't a place you conquer. It's a force you endure. It breaks those who come to own it, not with sudden defeat, but with slow exhaustion, 1,000 cuts of distance, hunger, and time. Napoleon learned it in 1812, Hitler learned it in 1941, and still, nations look east and see opportunity where history only leaves graves. That's the quiet cruelty of time. It erases fear faster than it erases fact. And when fear fades, the same mistakes are reborn. In every century, there's always someone who believes the world can be bent to his will, that maps and men are the same, things to be moved, captured, erased. They always begin the same way, with confidence, with conviction, with certainty that history will remember them as visionaries, and they always end the same way, in ruin, in exile, in disbelief that the world refused to obey. The Eastern Front remains a monument to that truth, not a monument of stone, but of silence, because silence is what follows after ambition burns itself out. When you walk the old battlefields today, you don't hear gunfire. You hear wind. You see forests where tanks once died. You see villages rebuilt where millions once fell. But under every field, under every forest, the bones remain, unseen, uncounted, unforgotten. Each one tells the same story, that victory is temporary, but consequence is eternal. The soldiers who froze outside Moscow didn't die for a cause. They died for a miscalculation, for a line drawn too far east on a map, for a leader who thought history was a script he could rewrite. And yet, their deaths changed everything. They slowed the German advance long enough for the tide to turn. They became the silent foundation of the Soviet counteroffensive, the reason why Berlin would burn 4 years later. In that way, their suffering became history's pivot point. Without Stalingrad, without Leningrad, without the frozen forests around Moscow, there would have been no victory in Europe, no liberation, no dawn after darkness. That's the paradox of the Eastern Front, that the greatest human tragedy also became the turning of the world. For the soldiers who lived through it, there was no glory in survival, only the knowledge that they had walked through hell and somehow returned. Many never spoke of it again. How could they? What words could describe a war where even victory felt like loss? But their silence built the world we live in. Every map, every border, every uneasy peace, all of it born from the winter that swallowed half of Europe. And so, even now, the echoes remain. You hear them in the speeches of leaders who talk about history as destiny. You see them in the eyes of soldiers marching under new flags, believing they're different, that this time it's justified, that this time it's necessary. But the ground they walk on remembers. It remembers everything. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what happens again when we stop paying attention. That's the real lesson of Hitler's mistake. It wasn't just a military failure. It was a human one, a failure to understand limits, empathy, consequence. A failure to see that no nation, no idea, no belief can survive if it wages war on reality. The Eastern Front was reality at its rawest. It stripped away the lies. It showed what ideology looks like when the cold sets in, when the fuel runs out, when soldiers freeze with rifles in their hands. It showed that no vision survives hunger, no empire survives hubris, and yet from that destruction came a strange kind of balance. The Cold War, for all its tension, was built on the memory of what unchecked power could do. For 40 years, the world stood on the edge of annihilation, but never stepped over. Because somewhere deep down, the memory of the Eastern Front held everyone back. That's how history preserves itself, not just through books, but through fear. A fear we can't always name, but one that whispers whenever nations rise too high. The lesson was written in snow and fire. Power without understanding destroys itself, and arrogance, no matter how strong, always meets the same end, buried beneath the weight of its own conviction. Now, more than 80 years later, the last survivors are almost gone. Their stories fade into archives, their memories into documentaries and footnotes. But history still watches. Because history doesn't age, it only waits. And somewhere, in an old photograph, you can still see them. Young men staring out at a horizon they thought they'd conquer. Behind them, the smoke of villages they'd burned. Ahead, a winter they would never survive. In that frozen moment, you can see everything. The pride, the blindness, the inevitable fall. The Eastern Front wasn't just where an army died, it's where the illusion of invincibility did. It's where the myth of absolute power met something it couldn't defeat, the vastness of reality itself. That's what makes this story timeless. Because every age, every empire has its own version of Barbarossa, its own march east into the unknown, its own belief that history can be commanded like an army. And every time, the result is the same. The snow returns. The roads vanish. The silence grows. And somewhere, deep in that silence, the echoes of the past begin to whisper again, reminding us that no matter how far we advance, we're never beyond the reach of our own mistakes. The memory of the Eastern Front is not just history, it's prophecy, a mirror held up to every future that forgets what came before. Because power fades, empires fall, names are forgotten, but memory survives everything. It waits for us in the quiet places, in the fields where no one goes anymore, in the frost that still settles over the ruins at dawn. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear it, not as accusation, not as judgment, but as warning. The past doesn't repeat itself by accident. It repeats because we stop listening. And the moment we stop listening, the next fatal mistake begins. So remember this, Hitler's greatest blunder wasn't just the invasion. It was believing that history belonged to him, that he could command it, bend it, reshape it in his image. But history doesn't belong to anyone. It only watches and waits for those who forget. Because in the end, the true battlefield isn't the land we fight over. It's the mind that refuses to learn. And that is where every war, past, present, and future, is either lost or won.